democracy ought to be understood as a critical part of the transatlantic security, political, and economic architecture. As I've just heard, there are a few congressional staffers among the audience, so maybe we will soon have a few more members in our network. And this brings us to our today's event. You will soon hear from Anna-Michelle Asimakopoulou, who is obviously a great expert on international trade, but certainly for us, what is even more important is that she's also a great friend of Israel, the US, and the Transatlantic Alliance, which is why she's also the vice chair of our Transatlantic Friends of Israel. It is due to this connection that we were able to initiate today's exchange. I wish you all a great discussion this morning, and now I have the honor to hand it over to Dale Petrovsky, President and CEO of the Dallas Regional Chamber.
Well, thank you, Daniel, very much for, we're very excited to be part of this program to bring these respected leaders together to talk about issues of international importance. Love partnering with you, and I'll say that on behalf of my colleague, Sarah Karabias-Rush, who's our Senior Vice President for International Economic Development. You know, a lot of people consider the Dallas Regional Chamber to be a local organization, but I can assure you our reach extends far beyond North Texas. Our business community is one of the strongest and most sophisticated, not just in Texas, not just in the United States, but in the world. We have 3 of the top 10 American companies headquartered here: AT&T, McKesson, and ExxonMobil. No other market, including New York City and Los Angeles, has more than 1. We have 3. We have 24 Fortune 500 companies. Most markets are lucky to have 5. We have 24, and they come from a range of industries: financial sector, aerospace, manufacturing, logistics, technology, healthcare. So there's no other market in the United States like Dallas, not even close. So when we serve our business community and we work to attract other companies to move to Dallas, we have to have a world view. And that's why partnering with the AJC on programs like this is right in our wheelhouse. Let's talk about today's format. Our panel will be moderated by Ken Hersh, President and CEO of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. Ken is one of the most respected leaders in the Dallas community. He is co-founder and former CEO of NGP Capital Energy Management. He serves as a senior advisor to the Carlyle Group's Natural Resources Division. Ken serves on the board of overseers of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the National Council of the American Enterprise Institute out of Washington. And he's a member of the Dean's Council of the John F. Kennedy School of Public Policy at Harvard. He's also a great baseball fan, and he puts his money where his heart is. He's one of the owners of the Texas Rangers. Ken will be interviewing 2 very respected public servants this morning. The first is the Honorable Anna-Michelle Asimakopoulou. She's an economist and an attorney. She spent several years in New York and Sydney, Australia, specializing in financial transactions and international banking law. Anna-Michelle has been a member of the European Parliament since 2019, where she serves as vice chair of the Committee on International Trade. Anna-Michelle is also a member of the Delegation for Relations with Israel. A big welcome to the Honorable Anna-Michelle Asimakopoulou. Joining Anna-Michelle will be Ambassador Ron Kirk, one of the most familiar faces of Dallas. He was our beloved mayor from 1995 to 2001, our first African-American mayor, and he earned a reputation for working really hard to bring together diverse coalitions to get things done. President Obama noticed that, and he tapped him to serve as a member of his cabinet when he went to the White House. Ron was the United States Trade Representative. He was the president's top trade advisor and his negotiator on all trade matters. And he's become one of President Obama's favorite golfing buddies. Ambassador Kirk is now senior of counsel for the law firm of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. He co-chairs the International Trade Practice Group, not surprisingly, and is a member of these practice groups: public policy, crisis management, sports law, and private equity. A big welcome to Ambassador Ron Kirk. So Ken, I'm going to turn things over to you to get things started.
Great, thank you, Dale. Before I get started, I want to remind everybody to weigh in on the Q&A button on your screen. And as the conversation moves into the Q&A portion, I'll try to get to as many as we can. Since we made the introductions, I don't want to waste much more time with that, and I want to just go straight into the conversation. And why don't we start with Madam Vice Chair Asimakopoulou. President Biden has clearly signaled that the United States wants to re-engage multilaterally. But there are two big components of, I'll call it the transatlantic relationship, that are different than they were under the Obama administration. First is Brexit. We now have a full separation of the UK from the EU. And the second is China. There's a clear sentiment now that China is to be considered more as an adversary alongside a trading partner. And there's some confusion, and I'll call it international schizophrenia on how to deal with China. But those are two things that are quite different than they were back in the 2010s. So how do you see the prognosis or the strategic engagement for the new administration given the current context?
Thank you, Ken, and many thanks to AJC and the Dallas Regional Commerce Department for this nice event and for the honor and the pleasure of being amongst this distinguished company today. Let me just say, Ken, that I'm obviously a fan of the transatlantic relationship, so I'm not going to be objective about it. I actually embody, I think, the transatlantic relationship. I'm born in the United States. My father's was a Greek, a Christian. My mom's an American of Jewish descent. I grew up in the United States, but I also grew up in Greece. I've served in the Greek Parliament, and now I'm a very committed person to the European Union and what it's trying to do, and a more federated Europe. But so, it's natural for me to defend this relationship. So you can understand that over the past few years, obviously watching the United States move away from multilateralism, watching what happened with TTIP, watching all this stuff, pains me. So I can tell you certainly that there is a mood and an appetite in Brussels for this reset in our relationship, for this partnership to be redesigned. Now, the world is a different place than it was 5 years ago. And I think that the two things you've mentioned, Ken, I'll touch upon also. I mean, first of all, we have Brexit, so we've lost a partner in Europe. And I can tell you that I don't think our relationship with Great Britain, Europe, I'm talking about Europe now, is going to be smooth sailing. There is no question that this is going to be a contentious relationship going forward. So, and then, the elephant in the room, China, we used to call it the elephant in the room. Now it's the elephant that has a seat at the table and is occupying more and more space at the table. So I don't know what schizophrenic approach we should take towards China. I'm actually a little bit more, I think personally, I'm much more clear that we have to be very firm with China. China's not going to change. So I don't see why we shouldn't just admit that. But I can tell you that I think at the moment, we need to have a joint strategy when we deal with China. In fact, we need to have a joint strategy, not just because we have a historic relationship which is based on democratic values, which is based on the rule of law, which is based on the market economy, which is based on fair competition and these kinds of notions, but because there is a big threat to democracy globally going on at the moment. And I'll close by saying this. I mean, just a few minutes ago, my staff sent me a copy of a paper that we finalized in my political family in the European Parliament, which is the European People's Party. This is the center-right party in the European Parliament. And this is a paper on Russia, which we just finalized because of what happened with Borrell. If anybody watched this last week, what happened with Borrell during his visit to Russia. And in that, we are making a very clear call for a transatlantic alliance in defense of democracy. And I'm just going to tell you that we're very clear that what we need is a joint pro-defensive democracy toolkit with joint sanctions, with the joint mechanisms. And we need this for defense, and we need this for human rights, and we need this for what's going on in the digital world right now with AI. And we need to have a firm alliance to keep democracy alive in the digital and the real world. So as an introduction, I would say, Ken, that I'm very, very optimistic that there is a lot of appetite on the side of Europe to move forward. And I certainly hope that there is on the side of the United States.
Great. And Ambassador Kirk, that raises a distinction. The United States views its relationship with China in many ways through a national security lens. And many parts of the world view the relationship with China through an economic lens. Given the last 4 years of, I'll call it, disengagement, are things too far gone? Are we able to come back to the table with credibility?
Ken, before I answer that, I'd like to join Anna Michelle expressing my thanks to the Dallas Regional Chamber, the AJC, for convening this forum. It's an important topic. It's a critical topic. For those of you that have joined us, if you're looking for fireworks, I don't know that you're going to get it, because I think my colleague, the member of Parliament, and I share very strong sentiments about the necessity of maintaining what has historically been the world's most successful relationship in terms of the transatlantic relationship. So, Ken, in a way, I'm using that to backdoor your question. Whether it's too late or not, we have no choice but to link arms again. From the good news is, at least as it relates to China, whether you believe that the approach that some would have called incrementally, that the Trump administration, was within their right to question. But what progress that we have made with China has been in recognizing that you're much more likely to get China to engage and move if it is done in a multilateral context, rather than them feeling as if they are going to lose face by doing something because the United States told them to do so, or the UK told them to do so. That it's much easier for them to move in a direction that we want them to go when it's done in that broader context, with not just the United States, the European Union, but typically that coalition includes the EU, the US, as you know, Canada, Mexico, in many cases, Australia, Singapore, and others. So we need each other. But the realities are, and Anna Michelle was quite correct. One, what's changed is this environment is, while I think it's easy for many of us to spend our time focusing on what we believe was either the missteps of the previous administration or their insistence on going along, you can't ignore the reality. This is a very different China under President Xi than it was under President Hu. And no matter how hopeful, whether that was naive or not, that we may have been going back to President Bush 41, to Bill Clinton, to George Bush, to President Obama, we are dealing with an adversary now that is bringing a much more muscular, nationalist approach to global economic affairs than we've seen before. And we have to be sober about that now. I am encouraged that, one, at least the Biden-Harris administration, I think, has at least moved optically to send signals. We want to be part of a global economic partnership with our traditional allies. And we've seen that in a number of immediate steps that they've taken in announcing we would, of course, rejoin the fight against climate change by becoming a part of the Paris Accords, then making a very strong, emphatic commitment to our relationship with NATO. And we're seeing the same, from as simple as not being the only country to stand in the way of the appointment of the first woman, the first African to be the leader of the World Trade Organization. But this is going to be a difficult road ahead. And I don't mean to make light of this, but Ken, because I'm such a fan of yours and you know the analogy in terms of baseball, the other challenge with these partnerships, it's like professional sports owners are their own worst enemies. They all go out and bemoan the skyrocketing cost of free agencies, and they all say we've got to get these under control. And then, Alex Rodriguez, hits the market or whoever, and one owner goes and blinks and signs into a contract. And our challenge with China is, while they are both an adversary, they are still one of the two largest forces to move an economy in the world. And as they very, very clearly are focused on continuing to move hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, the opportunity to partner with them to help them do so is one that is attractive to the United States, to the United Kingdom, to Israel, to the Europe, and so that partnership is one that has to recognize individual member countries are also going to act in their own economic interests. But I guess to stop, at least I will say, we have no choice but to rebuild this critical relationship.
Okay, so since you made a dig at baseball owners, I'm gonna, since you ducked my second question, I'm gonna turn that question to Anna Michelle. Is the United States re-entry credible? Given how split this country is, how does the EU view it if we say we want to come back to the table, and yet the next 4 years there could be another election which swings it in the opposite direction? How credible is our rejoining this conversation?
Well, Ken, we're in Europe, and especially in Greece, which, as you know, is the birthplace of democracy, but has seen a lot of divisive politics. So we're used to this. I mean, this might be sort of new to the United States, but it's not new to Europe. And actually, I have to say, if I think one of the really good things about Europe, the European Union, when it comes to politics, one of the bad things is that it moves very slowly. It can be not very decisive sometimes because it has these complicated mechanisms to make the decisions. It is a multilateral forum based on the principle of subsidiarity on many, many issues. But one of the good things is that it's very good in building consensus and getting over divisive, let's say, behaviors and these kind of what the US is facing now. So you're asking me if we actually believe that the United States is credible in these decisions. I think yes. I think that there isn't a huge credibility gap at the moment. I think that what we're thinking, I think that Europe was naive about a lot of things, but probably not about the United States as much as it has been, for example, about China. I think that Europe has been much more naive about China than, even though, formally a couple of years ago, we actually declared officially that they are a systemic rival. Still, I think that we haven't taken enough steps to protect European industry from a lot of the unfair practices that are taking place. And I'll tell you now that when the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment was finished in its negotiations just a few months ago, which we saw as sort of a recalibration of world order when you look at RCEP, when you look at the fact that, you guys have done phase one. So, okay, we all have to sort of start this discussion against China again on a par. But, having said that, now in the parliament, we're not at all happy about doing a deal with China when it's so absolutely blatant what's going on in terms of violation of human rights. Even though I agree with the ambassador, we recognize the huge economic potential and interests that are now entrenched in relationships with China from the United States and from Europe. So No, I think that credibility will not, let's say, stand in the way of this, let's press the restart button. I think, and this is just because Ron mentioned what happened with the WTO, I think that, it would build credibility a lot more quickly if it were a little bit more clear what the US is going to do about the appellate body situation in the WTO. I think that would help move things along. But I'll stop by saying that I think, there's some we have to find a place to start with big strategic wins, I think. And for me, whether you're looking at WTO, or you're looking at OECD, whether you're looking at multilateral fora, or whether you're looking at our relationship, for me, the digital space and e-commerce would be the place to start. I think that that's where, there wouldn't be so much bad blood from negotiations in the past, less credibility bridging to do, and more urgency on everybody's side, even when it comes to dealing with the threat from China, either security-wise or just progress-wise.
Right, and you raise a good point, and that is one of the quandaries from this side of the pond, that the EU isn't unified. Germany and France are taking steps to encourage Chinese investment, yet Romania and Lithuania are trying to distance themselves. Romania recently, to your point, made a big push to bar Chinese 5G and and other technology investments in the country, and they obviously, coming from an Eastern Bloc perspective, they're used to the big monolith at their door, and so they can kind of see it. You mentioned that Europe is used to divisive politics, but from an EU perspective, I hear you in wanting to get a unified EU together. But how should the United States view the EU when certain members are pushing? Macron starts talking about strategic autonomy, and yet and Lithuania and Romania, even though they're small countries, are taking steps. How do we make sense of it all? You may be used to the divisiveness, but we think of the EU now without the UK, but even within the EU, there's dissension. So I know Ambassador Kirk had to navigate that as USTR, but how should the average listener on this call view it?
Okay, I like I said before, I think that the pendulum is swinging the other way now. I mean, from our naivete, we're moving towards understanding, especially after COVID, which showed that there's some supply chains out there that have critical elements to them that we don't have any control over. And I think that gets kind of scary. And I think that that's why you hear more talk about this, what we're calling strategic autonomy, but in fact, open strategic autonomy. Now, what is that? That's, Brussels ease. I'll translate it for you. That's, how we have legal ease, we have Brussels ease. So in the Brussels bubble, you make up these terms that are supposed to embody a little bit of everything and, bring in a balance and have everybody be able to see a little bit of what they want. That's what open strategic autonomy is. So open, yes, of course, open. I mean, the EU is all about being a huge bloc that can trade. So we're going to be open, and we already have 40 agreements with 80 countries. So we're going to expand on this network. So open is open. And then strategic is, well, we're in a world where we have to be a lot more strategic. Geopolitics are directly linked to trade. You can't blame the EU for being the one who weaponized trade to the max in the past few years. That would be somebody else. So we have to get more strategic about our relationship with China, with the rest of the world. And then there's autonomy, which, everybody's like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean protectionism? No, it doesn't mean protectionism, but it does mean protection. And in fact, I like it because it's a Greek word. Autonomy is a Greek word. It comes from aftos, which means self, and nomos, which means law. And it literally means your right to make your own laws, to make your own rules. So the ability to be a standard setter, which is, if you think about it, the EU's main soft power. We have a Columbia law professor, Anu Bradford, calls it the Brussels effect. That means You're a huge market. You make the rules. People want to come sell in your market. They take up your rules. They play by your rules. So they use, they export the standards that they adopt so they can do business. That's what we did with GDPR. We made it a global gold standard. So I'm not scared about open strategic autonomy. I think it's a pretty good balanced direction where Europe can become more solid. And the more solid we become in taking care of our own, the better we can partner with the United States. So it's about protecting ourselves, and it's about coming into our own in this difficult relationship. Now, I'm not painting nothing pretty in pink here, but certainly not gray and gloomy.
Great. So, Ambassador Kirk, you had to deal with Brussels. I love it. I love the concept. The U.S. views the EU as much more as an economic bloc, as an economic unit, let's call it. We have NATO, which is kind of the defense and security institution. There seems to be convergence here in some of the issues that as we talk about China, but also Russia, where the economics and security start to overlap. How do you see the new administration navigating the security lens versus the economic lens vis-a-vis these institutions as it tries to re-engage?
Well, Ken, you framed it correctly, and I'm not so sure to answer that wasn't as much a question as it was an answer.
Oh, come on, you can do it.
Is the two are going to become much more fused now because the world has changed. I mean, it's interesting that I'm privileged to join this call, as a former U.S. trade representative, and not to, digress too much, but that office only exists because roughly, now 70 years ago, U.S. businesses and farmers and ranchers went to Congress and said, look, we need to have a divergence of our economic and our strategic interests. And they took the trade economic relationship away from the State Department, created this Office of U.S. Trade Rep so that we would singularly have the interest of American business in mind. But for reasons that you and Anna Michelle have articulated, those have begun to fuse. And so we just have to be thoughtful and we have to be adaptable. And as Anna Michelle said, we have to look at the world the way it is today. It's changed. We've changed. The way we do business has changed from 25 years ago when we admitted China into the World Trade Organization. And we have to be smart and thoughtful enough to say, look, we're different with a different universe. The issue of cybersecurity, which we haven't talked nearly about, is critically important to that. And the reality that in terms of digital commerce, e-commerce, that is one place where the traditional sort of transatlantic economies have a huge competitive advantage. And that should be a place we can start to begin to try to form some common ground. But you can't separate that from the reality of the strategic security issues. I do have to say one thing. I was laughing off camera when you were challenging Anna Michelle about our understanding of Parliament. I remember before my first trip to Brussels, I spent days with my team. Okay, is it the Parliament? Is it the European Union? I mean, who are we dealing with? The President of the Union, the President of Parliament, this. And finally, one of my staff members handed me a quote that I love. He said, look, some things are better understood if left unexplained. I just decided we would lead it with that. But Anna Michelle, I was laughing. I would think I would much rather spend our time trying to understand strategic autonomy than you all trying to understand alternative facts. So both countries have our challenges. But I would say, Ken, not to make light of it, I've always believed China's greatest competitive advantage right now, if you think about it, is there a one government, I would say, in terms of the broader concern about making democracy a real functioning effort, China and Russia can make a damn decision. I mean, it is, we are proud of being the largest democracy. You heard Anna Michelle talked about Greece being the birthplace of democracy. You know, one of our biggest challenges in both the European Union and in our Congress is how slowly it can take us to respond. But this is going to have to be an issue, at least as we talk about how we confront an aggressive China, in which increasingly it becomes less partisan because speed is of the essence here.
Right. So let's talk, Ron, let's talk about that because and Michelle brought it up with GDPR. So this slow moving institutional framework that the US and the EU and now the UK have to navigate runs counter to technology, which is moving faster every day. By the time we hold hearings on something that's 1.0 or 2.0, you know, by the time we come to a conclusion, the market's already on to 4.0. How can we best navigate? Because this is a new set of facts now. The battlefields are not manufacturing and tariffs as much as they are and finished goods. It's much more in around tech, and GDPR that took a long time, and that was kind of a leadership position that the EU took. How does the US follow behind that in thinking about big tech, because it's one of our greatest assets that we're most proud of these companies, but it's also revealed certain risks because of their size.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm going to be as biased about this as Anna Michelle was about her belief in the transatlantic relationship. And it's not just pride of authorship on my part, but one of the most compelling components of the Trans-Pacific partnership that we walked away from was anchoring within that now largest multinational agreement in the world, principles that related to digital commerce, e-commerce, cybersecurity that very much protected our interests. And I think of all of the missteps of the previous administration, withdrawing from that is the one that could have the most dangerous consequences. Now, the flip side of that is, and I know it will be difficult in this environment when rightly, and forgive me for not saying this, the number one focus of this new administration has to be getting control of the pandemic and getting our economy back. But if we are to protect those interests long-term internationally, we're going to have to confront the reality that we have to re-engage and become a part of that trend. I think at least one step is re-engaging and becoming a part of that Trans-Pacific partnership. It's not perfect, but Americans need to understand those elements in there as it related to digital commerce, e-commerce, unfair competition from state-owned enterprises, all were negotiated to our favor with our interest in mind. And so it is very much in our interest to at least use the tools that we have on the table. And then we can try to figure out how we navigate that with Europe. You know, our challenge with Europe is not that we have a difference of mind. Our challenge is we're the two of the more mature democracies and regulatory systems, and those can be harder to merge. But for the most part, the interests overlap. And the one good thing, most Americans don't see a threat from a trade agreement with an equal partner in terms of respect for human rights, values, legal systems, the way we do business. You know, people aren't afraid that all of a sudden all our jobs are going to be shifted to Europe the way they often, you know, reflexively respond to a trade agreement with the developing economy. But again, Ken, none of this is going to be easy. But as Trade Ambassador nominee Catherine Tai has said, we're just going to have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So we're going to have to do as many of these things simultaneously as we can. And let me say one final thing, and I would invite your listeners, because it's a pretty readable document. Visit ustr.gov if you want to see the new trade agenda laid out by the Biden agenda. A lot of people are hand-wringing over what a worker-centric trade agreement looks like, but the reality is we've been making the case for some time. If we cannot draw a direct link between our trade policy, how it protects and helps to create jobs here at home, then we've lost that battle anyway. But I would encourage anyone on the call to visit ustr.gov and at least just go over the fact sheet to get an understanding of what this administration's priorities are.
Great, thank you. And let's drill down a little bit to something to be more, I think, impact or appropriate for this audience, is the relationship between the US, the EU, and Israel. The new set of facts on the ground since 4 years ago are the Abraham Accords. This dovetails into the technology question, given that there's so much technology sharing between the United States, the EU, and Israel. Anna Michelle, how do you see both the impact of the Abraham Accords, and if you were to forecast whether you're bullish, bearish, or neutral on the trade relationship between Israel, the US, and the EU, how would you frame that, given your interest in that trilateral?
Let me just say that Israel is a very important trade partner for the EU. Ever since we have an association agreement with Israel that came into force in 2000, and the value of imports and exports between the EU and Israel have been increasing steadily in both directions. So unfortunately, we have a free trade agreement. That's what you called an old generation free trade agreement. It doesn't include any commitments on services, on investments, on regulatory convergence. So it's not a modern trade agreement by our standards. So I think, first of all, let me just say that it's high time for the EU to modernize its trade relations with Israel. I think that this is particularly important now, given the normalization of the diplomatic ties now between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And I think that the Abraham Accords are a fundamental step for the stabilization of the region and will have very significant benefits for the economy and for these relationships that Ken, you just mentioned. Israel has not traditionally participated in these regional power structures and alliances, but with the current competition in the Middle East between pro-Iran and anti-Iran camps, I think that the Abraham Accords will prove instrumental in creating the cooperation that's required to counter Iran's efforts against the stability of the region. So let me just add that there is a very strong incentive for the EU to strengthen its collaboration with Israel. That's what the Abraham Accord has given even more power to this incentive. And the first thing we need to do is call finally this association council. But we've been calling them as Transatlantic Friends of Israel. We've been asking for this, and we continue to ask and use this this council to plan for the future. Unfortunately, and this is just the way the union works. Yes, some member states, which have their own entrenched interests, have been blocking this, but the fight goes on. So, and just to come back to tech, I hear this a lot. Well, how can we regulate tech when tech is moving so fast? And that's nonsense. I mean, of course we can regulate. We just have to decide we want to do it. I mean, that's just an excuse not to do it. I mean, yes, it moves forward, but legal principles are legal principles. Issues around tech, even AI, which is now the flavor of the digital decade, AI is about liability and about transparency, and we can definitely regulate tech. We just have to decide we want to do it. And as Ron said, we have to do this together. This is critical. And I'll read I'll see the USTREs and see what I understand, Ron. And if I don't get something, I'll ask for a translation from the master. Okay.
Thanks. Now, before we get to the questions from our viewers here, Dale would kill me, Ron, if I didn't ask a Dallas question. So as Dale said in his intro, we're blessed here to be such an international city with so many global businesses. Can Dallas do more? Is Dallas doing enough, the right amount, or should it be doing more on the international scene with respect to trade and having a voice on some of these issues?
Well, you can listen. I think when it comes to when you look at the reality that Texas is spectacularly the largest beneficiary of our trade policy of all of the states. even more so than California. And Dale, you can put the correct answer in the chat for me, because I was notorious during our chamber city trips for getting my numbers wrong. But I want to say, Ken, something like 25, the last time I went on your institute, almost 25% of our jobs in the state of Texas are linked to trade. That number might skew, you know, a little bit higher or lower in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So one, I would always say, we can always do more. Whatever we're doing to make the case that the Dallas-Fort Worth area is one of the best to do business in the United States is only going to inure to our benefit. One, we have spectacularly the best asset in the world, which is the DFW airport. And as important as this transatlantic relationship is, I mean, I just have to note the beginning of our becoming a trade powerhouse was the passage of Nafta. Ironically, 6 months before I was elected as mayor in May of '95. And I said then what I believe, that with Dallas-Fort Worth at the epicenter, you know, 3.5 hours away or less from Mexico City, Canada, the East and West Coast, that we should become the capital city of NAFTA. We've done that. Now we need to extend that to Europe and other relations. I do have to know, just in light of your previous question, Tana Michelle, for those of you on the call that don't know, the United States, of our 50+ trade agreements, our very first trade agreement was with Israel. So it is the longest trade relationship that we have in the United States.
So let me follow up with a broaden the lens from Dallas to Texas, and it'll bring a strategic question to Anna Michelle, and Ron, if you want to weigh in as well. So the U.S. is now a significant exporter of natural gas through our liquefied natural gas. At the same time, Russia is building a new pipeline called the Nord Stream pipeline that will send gas directly into Germany and bypass the transit routes of the Ukraine. The U.S. prior administration was very negative on that pipeline for strategic reasons, because we wanted to keep, we were taking an adversarial tact with Russia and didn't want to bind that energy link too much, bind Europe to that energy link too much with Russia, especially as the U.S. is an exporter now. Do you see, Anna Michelle, do you see that pipeline, because I think it's now pretty close to being finished. How do you see that pipeline playing out? And if you could relate it to the market, the market for U.S. LNG.
Well, let me just say, first of all, now you've got to understand you're now talking to, I mean, yeah, I might sound American, and I am American, but I'm also Greek, which means I'm an East Med girl. So there you go. So there you have it. So that's why, you know, Greece, Israel, Cyprus, as you know, have a very strategic relationship when it comes to what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the East Med pipeline project is very, very important to us. And it's very important to us also in light of what's going on with Turkey and their aspirations on being nice in the region. So let me just tell you how I feel about Nord Stream 2, and that is, you know, I think it has to stop, and that's the position of my political family to EPP. But having said that, it's also, you just said, Ken, it's you know, it's a long way. It's almost finished, so that doesn't make me very hopeful that is actually going to happen. But you know, we can certainly push for that, and I think it wouldn't be a good development. I mean, I think let's say our interests are completely aligned. U.S. and European interests are completely aligned, and Israeli interests are completely aligned with putting a stop to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Right, and for the people, I don't know if you referenced it as the East Med Energy Consortium, which is essentially gathering Israeli gas, Cyprus gas, transporting it through Greece, and then on into Italy, which is a major new supply channel for Southern Europe for natural gas. There's also moves for Israeli gas to go to Egypt and get put into their LNG facilities to be exported. So you mentioned about that strategic alignment. We've had a couple of questions on the screen about COVID, and there's two issues with respect to COVID that the people have asked. One is I'll call it vaccine nationalism. How do you see that? It's a really current issue. It's an urgent issue. It's a global health issue. It's an emotional issue. How do you see that either hurting our long-term relationships or helping if we end up in this, if every country for himself, type vaccine distribution? Let me direct that to Anna Michelle.
Well, we shouldn't do that. I mean, we really shouldn't do that. I mean, in Europe, we've sort of managed not to do that amongst ourselves, because health in the European Union is not an exclusive. It's a competency of the member states. So we actually don't have to cooperate if we don't want to, but we decided it would make much more sense for us to cooperate, and that's what we did. Of course, our citizens are upset with us because of the pace of the rollout and the way these deals were made. They watch Israel, which is moving on at rocket pace, and they're like, hey, why are we behind? But still, I mean, and I'm speaking now as a Southern Europeaner, I mean, if this didn't happen, then I understand that smaller countries would have serious problems. And I can't imagine what it would be like for me trying to defend Europe to citizens once we were in a vaccine war. At the same time, I think it would be detrimental for our relationship to do that. So, but I don't really expect that that's going to happen. Maybe I'm being naive now, but I really don't think so. I mean, I think that, things are going to become a little bit more normal now in the rollout process. That's what I think. And I think our biggest enemy is not, we're not each other's biggest enemy, and our biggest enemy are not the pharmaceutical companies. Our biggest enemies is the virus and its mutants, and that's what we need to fight now. So again, this is a good place to join forces. And also, in Europe, we have this COVAX mechanism that we've joined, Team Europe, where we're also helping the rest of the world, because this is not going to be over until it's over for the entire world, and we understand that. So I think that we have a responsibility to join forces also to do that, because we're the only hope at getting that done. So
right, and Ron, will you answer that question just in the frame of, I'll call it U.S. leadership? These are the couple of the big companies. Obviously, we have three now, but are U.S. companies that are multinationals. You have companies like 3M that are multinational, that are deep into the PPE business. How, as USTR in your lens, how does America can they use it? Can we use it to reestablish our leadership?
It is, having grown up in the South in a Black church, I was always taught that the most effective theology to a starving man is a sandwich. No one practiced the theology of food better than my parents. To a world scared to death over a common enemy like this pandemic, the country that brings us together to address this will, I think, gain favor in ways unimaginable. My approach to these is always, I love African proverbs. And there was one I quoted when I ran for mayor that I think is appropriate here. It's simple, but it's profound. Two people in a burning hut don't have time to argue. Look, this is a case where we have all learned a painful lesson that because of advances in transportation, particularly air travel and technology, there is no such thing as a pandemic that only affects southern parts of China or Africa or western parts of the United States. So our approach has to be uniform. And one thing I'm most proud of is the Biden administration saying we will rely on science, we will engage with the World Health Organization, we will partner with others, and the sooner we get that under control, the better. Anna Michelle, thank you so much for acknowledging the fact this can't just be seen as making the US and Europe safe. We have to get this vaccine to those developing economies that are, and their citizens that are desperately in need of it as well. But I'm hopeful with the new approach of the new administration, re-engaging with the WPO, the World Health Organization, will unleash the best scientists in the world, particularly those in the supply chains now, because it's not as much of an issue, I think, of science as it is now. How do we get this vaccination manufactured and distributed and into the hands of people who need it as quickly as we can, no matter where they live?
Now, you mentioned the WHO, we've mentioned the WTO. I want to circle back to China because China has an important seat on those as well. Is China playing ball in trying to, with respect to the vaccines, because they have their competing vaccine, Russia has its vaccine, and now we're seeing vaccine diplomacy, where going, rather than doing it multilateral, unilateral vaccine distribution to peddle influence in various countries. Does that worry you, Anna Michelle?
Yes, it does. I mean, definitely China's doing that, use vaccine diplomacy very aggressively. And yes, that worries me. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned that we need to get our act together. I mean, it makes sense to get our act together anyway. Even if China weren't doing that, we would still need to, increase the rollout speed and also help the rest of the world, because we have a moral duty to, and because it makes sense, and because it's the right thing to do, and it's the smart thing to do. But I mean, yes, nature hates it when there's space for it to, it doesn't leave empty spaces. So if we don't do it, then China will do it, and Russia will do it, and that's the way it is. And so we better get a move on. And I'm glad that the United States is doing much more about that more quickly now. And so is Europe, actually. I mean, after getting off to a little bit, we had our spats in the beginning, and then we figured it out. We figured out that we have to get this right for our citizens, or they're just not gonna, they're not gonna forgive us. So
good. So we have a few minutes left, and we've highlighted on this call some pretty open dilemmas. Ambassador Kirk, you mentioned China's competitive advantage and that they can actually speak and make a decision, whereas the EU and the US and our other allies are great conversationalists first, and running their democracies and getting it together takes a little more time. That's obviously just structural. China is now, as you said, the elephant at the table. We have the divisive politics within Europe itself. And so I want to wrap it up, and I'll turn it to you, Ambassador Kirk, first. Are you on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolutely certain and optimistic that it'll come to pass, 1 being an absolute pessimist saying it doesn't have a chance? On a scale of 1 to 10, where are you on the pessimist versus optimist scale of this relationship and getting some good results?
Well, I guess maybe I'll make myself more. I am, my approach to when I was privileged to be in public service was always to operate as how Lloyd Benson used to define himself, a raging pragmatist. And I'll go back to Anna Michelle's opening comment. And look, I'm optimistic we'll get it right because we have to. Look, the positive is there is so much good that can be gained if we can construct a working partnership to help China achieve their objectives, because I don't believe they can get there alone. They need our science, our ingenuity, our technology, which is why we have to pay attention to cyber. But as Anna Michelle has said, we just have to be very sober about how we go about doing that. We can't go into this starry-eyed and think, oh, China, and pretend as if China doesn't desire to try to force the moving of technology. And we talked a little bit about our challenges, but I said this to our colleagues in China, they have their challenges as well. Look, China's done a marvelous job of moving tens of millions of people out of poverty. But to some degree, US corporate interests have been complicit in that, because what China cares more than anything is there can be no daylight and their economic interests, and they see that as the more they can say, we've got 100 million people working, they don't care about the lectures from the EU and the US about democracy. We have been complicit in helping them create those jobs. And China's fear, the one hedge we have, and I used to say to our friends in China, the toughest call the head of one of those multinational companies that Del Petrosky mentioned when we opened, the hard call is when they've got to call the governor and mayor and say, hey, we're leaving Dallas, Chicago, LA, and moving our manufacturing plant to Hangzhou. What I told the Chinese, if you keep trying to steal their technology, they owe you nothing. There are other developed economies they can pick up just as quickly and leave China and move those jobs to Africa, to Bangladesh, to India, to Latin America, any of the other developing economies that would love to have the ability to have those first generation manufacturing jobs. So I would just close with what our distinguished colleague said. We've got to be sober. We've got to be willing to use all the tools we have to get China's attention and then get them to be more thoughtful in protecting our core rights and seeing that this is either an opportunity we can work together for both of our prosperity, or we can go ahead and engage in a head-to-head competition. But I think at the end of the day, the biggest hammer we have, open democratic societies with economies that encourage innovation over the course of history have always prevailed in the long run. So it is going to be a long game. If we're sober, if we're thoughtful, if we're resolute about how we engage China, I'm confident we'll be okay in the end.
Okay, so despite that upbeat conclusion, Ron said he was a 5 or a 6 on my scale of 1 to 10. So Anna Michelle, wrap us up. And where are you in the raging pragmatist or the optimist on my scale, and bring us home?
I'll say that, okay. Okay, I'll be the optimist. How's that? I'll be the optimist because I'm going to focus on the fact that when it comes to China, I mean, okay, first of all, let's not play hide and seek. I mean, how long are we not going to look at, what's going on with human rights? How long are we not going to look at what they're doing in Hong Kong? How long are we not going to look at what they're doing to the environment in order to extract the critical raw materials that we're so incredibly dependent on now to make our transition to a greener, more electrified world, which we can't do if we don't have their lithium. So, let's be, I'm all for what Ron said. Let's be pragmatic. And if we're pragmatic, we're going to have to hit the middle of the scale to whatever. But I'm going to be optimistic because I think it was Ron who said before that they have an advantage, which is the Russians and the Chinese. They can make a decision. That's because they don't ask anybody. They just make a decision and they force it on people. But that's called autocracy. And, between autocracy and democracy, which is much more complicated and much messier and much more tiring and much more frustrating, especially for policymakers, I'll take democracy any day. I'll live in a democracy any day where it takes a long time to make a decision and sometimes even make the wrong one. And you get divisive until you finally reach consensus over autocracy where somebody, does facial recognition on the street and grades me for whether I'm a good citizen in order for me to get my next promotion. Any day I'll take that. So I'll go up on the scale, Ken, because for me, this scale also has urgency in it. And it's just urgent that we figure this out. And that way we can move from Ron's pragmatism to my optimism. Okay.
Great. Well, I agree. And at the Bush Institute, we are all about advancing free societies and strengthening our democracy and supporting those democracies around the world. Because I think that history, as Ron says, does prove out that open societies generally thrive. They become natural trading partners. They can solve problems together. And I do think that we are embarking upon that opportunity. And the COVID vaccine is a great opportunity to show the world what we can do. Anyway, I want to say thank you to both Ambassador Kirk and Vice Chair Asimakopoulou for being with us. Great conversation. And I will now turn it over to Joel to wrap us up. Again, thank you both.
Thank you, Ken, for so ably facilitating our discussion this morning. And on behalf of AJC and the Dallas Regional Chamber, thank you to Vice Chair Asimakopoulou and Ambassador Kirk as well for your insights on these critical issues. I'll look forward to being with many of you virtually on Thursday at noon for the Chamber's annual meeting. For more on the future of the Transatlantic Alliance, I encourage you all to join AJC and the World Affairs Council next Tuesday evening as part of our annual International Perspectives series. We'll be hearing from Karen Donfried, President of the German Marshall Fund of the US. Finally, please mark your calendar for June 3rd, as AJC's Community of Conscience Coalition will host an evening devoted to advancing pluralism and democratic values. The evening will include speakers of diverse backgrounds and both sides of the aisle on some of the most pressing issues of the day, and will include the inaugural presentation of the Community of Conscience Award for Bipartisanship, which will be presenting to Congressman Van Taylor and Colin Allred. So we hope you'll join us for a very special evening on June 3rd. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.